Is Alberta independence movements threatening First Nations? Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation, something awesome, which supports Alberta and Canada. And I want to thank them for this gift. Through their legal counsel at O'Kelly Law, they commissioned an affidavit for the Alberta Court of King's Bench to get some expert witness testimony or input on the Government of Alberta's Citizenship Initiative and the referendum petition process. This is Hazardscape, Indigenous Emergency Management. This new independent Alberta could go into bilateral agreements without First Nations. And if you like this video, please like and subscribe so other people like you have an easier time finding it. Before I really dive into all of this, I want to set an expectation up front to anyone listening. One, I do not represent Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation. I'm not affiliated with them, paid by them. I've not been asked to do this. I'm doing this on my own accord. I don't know O'Kelly Law, and I don't know Wesley Wark. Second, this affidavit is about concerns with Alberta's citizen initiative legislation, the petition process for the referendum for regarding Alberta independence, and I think maybe even a little bit of the referendum process for anyone that's trying to get one going. And then it's also concerns foreign interference in the whole referendum petition process. This is my interpretation of how I've read it, but the Alberta Prosperity Project is mentioned. I would have to assume that they're mentioned in reference to foreign interference because they've publicly come out and provided that information. Forever Canada is mentioned because they're another group that has also submitted a referendum petition. We have evidence that Alberta Prosperity Project has said they've involved foreign entities. To my knowledge, I don't know if Forever Canada is seeking funds outside of the country. I would equally be disappointed in that move. This is a prime example of how First Nations want to work with non-Indigenous communities in the federal government to make a better society. They didn't have to do this. And they certainly didn't have to share it publicly, even though maybe the Court of King's Bench, it will be public information at the end of the day. I don't know. But they certainly didn't have to, go too deep into anything outside of First Nations. Like this is, First Nations have a perspective of sovereignty that many Canadians don't, because I think these are my words, my interpretation, but First Nations are extremely vulnerable and under threat from, Canada, a foreign nation in all sense of the term. So they're always on guard with policy changes, big shifts in policy, funding. So for them to kind of look at this and say, here's everything we need, and this is who we need to provide evidence, it's a great gift for all of us. And I really encourage you to go through the affidavit or at least watch this whole video. The affidavit is a legal court document. It's almost kind of like providing a witness statement. It's a written, accepted by the courts as evidence. The link for the document is in the comments. If you want to read it, it's 107 pages. The affidavit was written by a gentleman named Wesley Wark, who has, plus or minus 40 years in Canada's security intelligence sector and probably looks at this from a global perspective. He's got his PhD. He's very well credentialed. He's testified in multiple federal and provincial courts and parliamentary committees on security policy. So I looked into his background a little bit. I did some Googling. He's got a Substack. So if you want to know a little bit more about him, go out and look, but I find him credible. First Nations, you have to be very concerned at this point with foreign interference in Alberta. especially around what they say in the affidavit is coined as a citizen initiative petition process, where if it's a citizen-led initiative, what First Nations or Indigenous citizens or members or people are involved in this citizen initiative? And for me personally, the concern is there's foreign actors involved and involved with the Alberta independence movement. Is that really a citizen initiative if it's being led and paid for by foreign entities? I think it was about 5 years ago, I read this book, Me Tomorrow by Drew Hayden Taylor. It's a compilation of Indigenous people that have provided sort of the vision of what they'd like for their future. And it brought me awareness to the need for an Indigenous or a First Nations led security and intelligence system or organization. The scope of the expert opinion was centered around to assess the likelihood that foreign states like Russia, China, the US, even India could intervene in the petition signature collection process, much like they could, these are my words, impact the democratic process through voter interference. It was also meant to examine the historical precedences, current policy environment, and mechanisms that could be leveraged around digital disinformation, financing, diplomatic outreach. So my purpose for doing this video and looking through the affidavit is a couple of things. One, I wanted to get some clarity on what is the actual potential impact or harm to First Nations, all Indigenous peoples and communities, and their sovereignty, and Canada's sovereignty. I wanted to get that. Then I also wanted to kind of measure, what were the findings, the implications, and how involved would this be from a First Nations point? I'm not going to give an all-encompassing view. What I did was going through the affidavit, I just looked at some key findings, recommendations, trends. Don't take my word on all of this, because hell, I barely got out of grade 12. I graduated because I got good grades in cooking and woodwork and metalwork and mechanics. I just happened to have gotten lucky and gotten into an emergency management role. I moved into that role, and it again, like I said, it overlaps with this area and a lot of the people that I support. Anyone else can open up the document and go through it more thoroughly. And if you find something that is of interest that you think everyone should know, please comment. I certainly am not going to report everything in it. And if you want to fact check me, please, my pleasure. Take a look at the document. Again, this is not my research. It's Wesley Wark's, and I am just taking it as expert opinion. So some of the key findings: foreign interference has been an issue for Canada dating back to 1984. Oh, that's a weird date. When the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, or CSIS, was formed. Actors and motives like China, Russia, and India, and other traditional adversaries, that we all kind of expect. But there's a new dimension to this coming out of the U.S. most recent election. Is the U.S. dimension is now a security concern. We're facing multiple state sponsors with different strategic goals and objectives now. And what are the methods that these actors are using, from disinformation, misinformation, financial funneling through various entities, diplomatic pressure included? These threats span both online and offline. Are there signs of escalation? So since the 2022 Freedom Convoy, interference tactics have become more sophisticated and coordinated, as Wesley Wark states in the affidavit. And, recent events have sort of hardened the capabilities and intent of these groups. This was not explicitly pointed out in the affidavit. This is just my thoughts on it. But the reason for the inception of the Freedom Convoy in the document is just to highlight that foreign interference operations and financing and campaigns are active, as evident from that convoy. And it just provides a case study or case illustration that, warrants the need for a greater risk assessment in Alberta with additional monitoring and response mechanisms. Digital amplification through Facebook ads, paid ads, targeting of demographics, even paid influencers that could inflate the support and sort of weave doubt into the legitimacy of, organizations for or against. The alleged $500 billion US sort of line of credit is mentioned in the affidavit that could be used as a campaign to subtly steer outcomes. And there was legal ambiguity mentioned in the document. And then there was questions around the Citizenship Initiative Act that was just, I think, amended again and brought forward. And then Bill C-70, there's no concrete federal response to those. There's nothing in those that provide monitoring or mechanisms of activities. So that's also a significant risk to the petition process. Wark also discussed a little bit about the Alberta Prosperity Project itself as a self-described education initiative that is heavily practicing Trump-era policies and claims U.S. support for independence of Alberta. And then there's multiple trips to Washington by the APP, which, Wark states that these engagements raise the probability that the U.S. could facilitate interference, whether financially, through communications, diplomatic, or providing information. So these are Wark's kind of findings that I've summarized, but one of the potential harms if interference is successful is undermining the legitimacy of a referendum outcome. Whether it's yes or no, was there interference in either of those answers? Erosion of public trust in institutions, economic destabilization, especially in the oil markets, and continued social polarization, which is going to continue to divide us and create social unrest. What does Wark recommend as future steps? Enhanced monitoring of the signature process or signature collection process. Real-time intelligence sharing between the RCMP, CSIS, and Alberta authorities. I would throw First Nations in there in terms of maybe somehow creating a group within the RCMP system to be a central, committee, or not a committee, but a central key contact. Transparent reporting to the public and legislative clarification on the Citizenship Initiative. And more engagement with the U.S., with not only the provinces, territories, and federal government at the table, but Indigenous communities, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So 3 big things for me that the affidavit says. 1, the affidavit establishes that foreign interference is not a theatrical or potential risk. It's active, it's multi-layered. It now includes the United States. Alberta's independence is now at the point where it's at this nexus of energy economics, regional politics, and global power competition. And he concludes that there needs to be more robust safeguards, especially legal, procedural, and around intelligence-driven information. These are all essential to restoring and keeping a democratic process that has integrity. So the affidavit itself treats treaty breach as a material legal risk that the court must consider. Wark also points out in the affidavit that Indigenous communities need to be vigilant because they are also very, very vulnerable and susceptible to, being corrupted by foreign interference and foreign interactors through these campaigns. And to watch out that, your culture or treaty issues are not turned into information manipulation tools. The absence of a foreign interference monitoring framework not only harms Canada, but it's definitely, in my opinion, and it's pointed out in the affidavit, that there's potential harm to First Nations because they're vulnerable anyway. And if there's no monitoring framework in there that is specific to First Nations, that's going to cause a even greater risk. And he states if the petition leads to a change in jurisdiction, then there's no guarantee that First Nations will have any negotiation ability regarding their land and resources. And it could affect the lives and livelihoods of anyone on and off reserve. And, the other risk too is that this new independent Alberta could go into bilateral agreements without First Nations. Work recommends that First Nations be included in any monitoring and oversight mechanisms. And as I said in that book, that's really why I've always thought that First Nations need their own security gathering or intelligence gathering and security service, whether that's through existing institutions or they create their own. So bottom line, key takeaways for First Nations: legal exposure through the petition and referendum process, targeted vulnerabilities, foreign actors using First Nations issues and grievances to create an even more potential conduit for misinformation and disinformation. There's policy gaps. There's no monitoring mechanism in place, which is going to mean for First Nations that they're left out again and they don't have a protective layer. Economic risks. If unilateral agreements are made, that could mean, or bilateral agreements are made, that could mean First Nations are left out of consultation, benefits of oil pipelines. Things could physically on the land get moved around reserves. So the big takeaway for me is, one, Indigenous peoples and communities need to be involved to ensure treaty compliance and their participation. And frankly, for me as a Canadian, the risks highlighted, and these are my words in the affidavit, I think these risks exist to most communities across Alberta, whether the majority of that community is on board or not. If that community isn't getting information, intelligence, reporting about who's really driving the Alberta Prosperity Project and other groups financially, strategically, those communities, frankly, are at the same level of risk. And if they're deciding to put all of their trust into a group like the Alberta Prosperity Project without having open, transparent, fair reporting from that group, combined with good intelligence, they don't have all the information, which, again, these are my words. It does make me very hesitant to believe anything this group is saying. Work goes into several areas that kind of question not only First Nations impact, but Alberta as a whole, especially around seniors and pensioners. Are they going to have the equivalent or same pension support that they currently do in the CPP? If an independent Alberta becomes a reality, there's no way to tell if policy shifts do harm for Alberta or not. Foreign interference, Wark states, can increase the cost of living through influencing policy changes and pricing and social program funding. Families could experience higher taxes as a result, especially if the referendum leads to a new regime. And I think for me, after reading this affidavit, seeing the cost of food go up, funding shifts for social programs, how much of the current foreign interference is already creating a situation where our costs are increasing because of that interference. He doesn't state in the affidavit if that exactly is or isn't happening. It's just a question I have. And then there's the regular, small business to larger Canadian business environment. The rapid policy shifts, the rapid uncertainty, the off and on tariffs, those are all resulting from foreign interference. Even businesses outside of Alberta could see a drastic change in their revenues due to supply chain and logistic changes and fallout. So again, 107-page affidavit. This is just a very quick breakdown of information. I recommend you go in and read it for yourselves. But given the impacts and the risks and the things that need to be done to mitigate those from his experience and perspective, I will definitely be pushing, my MLAs, my members of parliament, ministers to adopt some of these recommendations. So thank you to Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation with O'Kelly Law and Wesley Wark for this.